Hello, welcome to Mark Langley's Horsemanship Podcast, a podcast helping people to understand their horses better, to provide solutions in a calm, connected way. I'm Jenny Barnes.
And I'm Mark Langley.
Mark, your first question is from Stella. She says, does it matter where I work with my horses? Should I separate and work with them away from their buddies? Should she work with one in a place where they can see each other? Or work one when the other's moving freely about in the same arena? Or does it matter? Is one way better than another? Her goal is to achieve focus while dealing with distractions and provide a safe environment as they progress towards confidence.
Thanks for the question, Stella. That's a good question because it's basically, I think, no matter what we're doing with our horses, we're always going to come up with this same scenario. Also the scenario of separation anxiety, connection disability, things like that. Basically, you want to work in an environment with your horse that you can get something done or achieve. So that's the first thing you want to think about. So in a lot of cases, it all depends on the horse. So if you've got a horse that suffers from really bad separation anxiety, they're not used to leaving their friends or being away from their friends, then the lesson would usually always start in an area close to their friends. So their anxiety level is just at a normal sort of, they don't suffer from high anxiety. That's what I'm saying. They're not super stressed or anything like that. And then you can sort of show them the things that you need to show them so they can learn. And what I do is then I move away from the horses a little bit for my next lesson, or sometimes I can shift the whole mob near the yards. Whatever you want, but for certain, few lessons, could be sort of between 2 and 10 lessons. It just depends on how you're going with the horse and what you're teaching them. But some horses you can take to another environment. But if you took a horse to a completely different environment to educate it, and you weren't able to help it at all because it didn't have it didn't have enough education and things like that, then it would have been a waste of time by trying to educate it in a different environment. So I always start around the horses and then slowly work my way to other environments so I can take the horse away on its own. But it's just you treat it like graded exposure. And then, you get to a stage that you lead the horse somewhere that you can train it out of eye shot from the other horses. But to get there, you might work it in a few different spots beforehand.
Okay, and staying on separation anxiety, Carrie has a question on floating. She says, do you have any tips on separation anxiety and floating? She says, I understand that you consider separation anxiety connection disability and floating problems to be a lack of understanding and thought of the float. She's trained float loading and unloading to produce softness and understanding, but the horse that she has still sweats and suffers anxiety when she's by herself. It starts as soon as she closes the top door of the float and she can no longer see her. She floats perfectly with another horse. So is there anything she can do? Because at the moment she can't travel with her alone.
Yeah, this is, I guess, that question, Carrie, is one of those questions that we're all going to come across. As there are some horses that once they're closed off in a float on their own, they're isolated, and it's not really familiar for them to have such isolation because they're a herd animal. So how we build and how we educate them is going to be very important to how well they go in the horse float. So what I firstly, like what you said, I call separation anxiety connection disability. But once a horse goes in a horse float, you're not there. So separation anxiety, technically, once your horse is sort of educated and connected with you, is only there when the horse is on its own. So when you leave the horse in the float on its own, that's when it suffers from separation anxiety. But I'd say there's a fair few things in the float that we have to look at as well. So, and going back to a lack of understanding, so if the horse does all the things that you ask well away from the float, and then you ask them those questions near the float or on the float, how softly does your horse, you know, listen to all those things, and how well does it listen to those things. So the things that you might be looking at is how well does it step back and come forward, on the ramp in comparison to just out in the paddock or in the arena or where you work it. If there's a resistance at the float, then obviously there's still a little bit of work to be done there, and if the horse is softly engaging with the question, but also when you stop and give it space, it engages with the float. So the other thing I do with your horse is have it well educated, test the education at the float, but then give it plenty of time in between. So when you might be standing near the float or front feet on the float, 4 feet on the float, for the horse just to stop and think about everything and just see, you know, just really assess how even your horse is, as in what I said before, is it just as willing and soft on the float as it is when you're not doing the lesson on the float. If it's not, then work on, yes, the disciplinary part of it, which is follow a feel softly, and then give it a little bit more time to stop and keep its thoughts in the float until it sort of tests the float a little bit more itself. So go back and work on that, because that's quite important. And then next thing I'd be looking at is helping educate your horse to self-load so it goes in ahead of you. So that would mean that you would work up to you standing at the ramp and sending it in, and it being able to stand in there on its own. So how you do that is you might start halfway in the float with your halfway in, and just get your horse to lead past you up to the chest bar, and then back out again up to the chest bar. And then you might, while it's at the chest bar, handle down to its hip, handle back to its head, handle down to its hip, and just stand there. And then from maybe where the breeching bars are, is ask your horse to go past you into the float and stand in there quietly. And then from the ramp, ask it to go all the way in, stand quietly, and back out. And grade the exposure, as in what I mean is you might do it for a short bit before the horse gets stressed. You take it off and then put it back on again, and slowly build the time that it's in there. That would help. So then you get to a stage you can put your horse in, self-load it, put the breeching bar on, just go around the float, fiddle for a bit, do some things, and then undo the breeching bar, lead your horse back out of the float, then put it back on, close the breeching bar, and let it go in for a little bit on its own, spend some time in there, and then come out again. That's also going to help it. Now, if a horse suffers from claustrophobia, and then it's going to be a long road anyway. Like you can get them really well educated, but you still have to have a certain amount of exposure, safe exposure in the float, and then also a lot of sort of moving the float while you load them and stuff like that. What I would do, instead of closing the back door right off, and closing, so the other thing is most definitely is teach your horse to self-load without any front doors open. So that, you know, sometimes people open a front door so it looks quite open, and then they're deceived into thinking, oh, this is a nice big space, and they go in there, then all the doors close up, so the horse starts to feel claustrophobic. So I always make sure that I've taught them to load with all the front doors closed, as claustrophobic as I can make it, so I know that they're walking in there with confidence. I'm not fooling them in there only to trap them later. So the biggest thing is probably when you close it up into darkness and you close that back one. So what I would say is take her for little drives around the paddock without the back one open. So leave it with the back one open, and just get her used to travelling on her own with the back one open. Once she's travelled on her own, unload her, load her, travel her a little bit again, like only for 30 seconds if you want, close it, travel for another 30 seconds, open it again, and just grade the amount of time that she's in there with it fully enclosed, and lots of on and off, and then, as you've probably seen me do, is plenty, and this is for everyone else with loading issues, is plenty of, once the horse is in the confined space, whether it be an angle load float or a straight load float with the breech and bar and the chest bar, get them to walk backwards and forwards and feel all their boundaries, and carry with your horse in particular you're feeling for the horse softly, listening. If you've got any freeze, brace movements, sort of stuck movements, things like that, then you know your horse is not coping well in there. By the way, it's not listening to you when you ask it to do something. But if it's listening really well to what you're asking it to do, and it feels, as I said before, just as good as it does outside in its best environment, then you know you're making some headway, especially on the claustrophobia. Because once a horse starts to feel claustrophobic, it's very hard for them to hide that nervousness and brace. So when you ask them a question, you'll feel the difference in them. And I ask horses a lot of little questions inside the float until they're sort of softly listening to something, and then I let them stop, let them have a little decompress for a second, and then ask them a few things. And as I say, you're going to be sending her in on her own a lot. But yeah, anyway, it's a bit of a long road when they're a bit claustrophobic. But
do you think you can fix claustrophobic horses?
With good education and with commitment, you can help with it a lot till it starts to get a lot better. I think most of the horses that I've seen that seem a little claustrophobic, they've just never had enough education time.
Yeah.
And for everyone just to take this and put it into reality, if you look at, say, a cutting horse that's going to go to a futurity, I believe that the cutting horses might get started young, and when they're sort of 2 years old, they'll go into their futurity training. So, and they'll be 18 months training to 20 months training, and that's sort of, fairly solid training, so they can cut. And how many hours do you think they've spent sort of going on a horse float out of that 18 months? So if it puts it in perspective, if it takes that long to teach a horse to cut and build up for cutting, then the most unhorsed place is a horse float. We owe it to them to spend, especially if they really struggle, to spend a little bit of time or a fair bit of time getting them to really understand that it's okay. So, some foundations take 6 or 8 years for a good riding foundation, and I think you can sort of allocate a fair bit of that time into floating for the troubled horses, and then you'll find that there's less claustrophobia out there. I don't think we address it enough.
Oh, that's good to hear. So, horsemanship sayings. One of your sayings is connection disability. We mentioned that. So that's instead of separation anxiety. You like to use the words connection disability because it's focusing people on the solution, I suppose. Another saying out there is the tree of knowledge. Andrea says, what are your thoughts and what seems to be a common method of tying horses up when they play up in training to a tree or a fence for them to grow a brain?
Horses have already got a brain, and education educates them. That's the way I see training, and whether we call it the tree of knowledge or the tree of patience or whatever the post of patience, whatever it is, there's a lot of thought on using patience poles to sort of help horses. Some horses they'll tie them up till they settle. Some horses have been a bit stirred up when they've been being educated, so then they'll tie them up for a long time. It will not teach them to grow a brain. It will not help them with whatever you were trying to educate them with, that's for sure. And there's a really good saying that I think's it's one of my favourite sayings when it comes to sort of leading and tying up. And the saying is the best way to teach a horse to tie up is don't tie it up. So if anyone was thinking about tying a horse up for a while, and in education it is important to tie horses up for increments of time and build up that time so they know that they can stand settled if you need to tie them up for a while and go away and come back and things like that. It's essential in horses training to teach them to cope with being tied up. But tying up doesn't educate a horse if you had educational problems riding. Mm-hmm. Tying up is something that you show a horse or you ask a horse to do once it leads really well, and once a horse can follow a field really well, and they can. Following a field means when you lift up a field on a rope, the horse follows it without question. So when the field goes quiet, the horse goes quiet with the rope, Once the horse really understands that and it can lead up really nicely, then you can hang that rope anywhere. The horse will stay with that rope and not put a lot of pressure on it. And if we put a lot of effort into how we educate our horses, then they'll tie up a lot better for their first experiences tying up when you walk away and do stuff on their own, because you've taught them to be confident with that rope and confident to have a still, quiet mind and things like that. And then you tie them up, because there are horses that if you tie them up, they're uneducated. They just start to panic and dig a hole in the ground until eventually they just shut down and go into sort of a place of learned helplessness. And they didn't really learn anything except to stand still and brace, or paw for a long time and things like that. And I don't like seeing horses moving around for hours on end only to finally quit, because they're not learning anything for that time. Though eventually they quit, and they might next time realise that when they're tied up it's futile to sort of do all that. You run too much of the risk of them just going la 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 and just going into a bad place that you don't want a horse to go into.
Would it affect how they feel about us? Would they hold any resentment to us, or would they go, oh, I better not do that because they're going to tie me up? Does that sort of situation occur at all?
I think horses live in the moment more. Tying up will not ever, even if you tied a horse up in a bad way, it's not going to resent you for it, because you're not doing anything to the horse. Horses resent people for doing stuff to them. So when the horse is scared of the human's energy and scared of the person, they remember that. But I've seen horses get in awful binds and come out of binds and be soft with a person because the person didn't do it to them.
Right.
So it's not that they're going to become frightened or anything of the person because of that pressure that they were under tied up. They'll just associate tying up as a bad thing, maybe, especially if they spent half an hour stressing or an hour stressing only to finally sort of quit. And if a horse can pace a fence constantly, you got to think of it like this: if a horse can pace a fence constantly for 2 hours, then it'll dig. It'll. Some horses will stand for a long time stressed, and I don't think that's right. But anyway, back to the question. The question that you were really sort of getting at is if a horse is not understanding education, you can tie it up all day if you like, but it's not going to help it understand the question you're asking it when you're educating it. So it might, if you tie them up all day in the sun, it might knock some energy out of them and stuff like that, because by the time you go to work them, they're going to be all but a horse that's really frightened, it doesn't matter how tired they are or how mentally tired they are from sort of struggling on the end of a rope or a patience pole, is if they're really frightened, you get them back in, they'll frighten and they still have adrenaline, and adrenaline will create all that energy again. So it's not going to help a nervous horse make them feel any better about you. If the horse is playing up a bit under saddle, it's probably you've got to work out what was happening under saddle or before you rode that was causing the problem, what triggered the anxiety, what caused the anxiety at that time, because going and tying it up and bringing it back to work is not going to help it at all. But for anyone that wants to tie a horse up, teach them how to lead and grade their exposure on their own. Just like I was talking about a floating lesson about a claustrophobic horse. You go in, the horse comes out, and for a horse that doesn't tie up very well or paws the ground or suffers from separation anxiety, then you teach it how to lead really well. So technically when a horse learns how to lead really well, you can put it out on the end of a long rope, drop that rope on the ground, the horse will stand and be centred in its mind because you've taught it to be more centred and confident. Then once the horse leads really well and is more centred and confident with that rope, you can tie it for small increments and then build those increments up to longer increments that it can tie up on its own and not be stressed. But that has to happen first. Education is the most powerful thing.
Okay, and last question for today is from Karen. She's wondering if you can talk about your preference for reins when you're first introducing the snaffle bit.
Yeah, when I read that question, I was like, it's a good question, because I think sometimes not really thought of the weight of a rein, and there's so many reins on the market, and I guess some people buy the reins they like to hold in their hands. And what does a horse like to hold in its, if it's got a bit in its mouth, what weight does it like to carry? Now, there was a clinic some time ago, and I'm going to just give you a bit of a scenario just to sort of let you think about, for everyone to think about. Is there's a clinic, and this horse had quite a busy mouth, but he was suffering from other anxieties as well, but he was very sensitive in the mouth, and the person was riding with McCarty reins with quite heavy slobber straps, and the horse started to get a habit of sort of shaking the bit in its mouth, and then what had happened, the big slobber straps would shake around, and they were causing a lot of feedback. And even when the horse was sort of, walking and trotting, it was a lot of feedback on its mouth as those slobber straps were swinging from side to side, things like that. And that feedback was way too much feedback. So I encouraged the rider to try a different, just a sort of a lighter leather set of reins. And the amount of head fight probably in the horse disappeared. The amount of head fight that disappeared was probably about 50%. So I thought that was pretty good. We didn't, 50% by just changing a tool is pretty good, because usually I would say education is the strongest tool. But the amount of feedback that the heavy slobber straps and everything was giving the horse in its mouth was way too much. So when it got less feedback, it started to quieten and then listen to the reins a lot better. So with horses with very dull mouths, you can dull them more by having way too much weight flapping around. So I don't encourage, if I use it, even the little slobber straps I only use little slobber straps. I don't use big heavy slobber straps that flap around, things like that. So I wouldn't go to, because by the time you tie whether it's a horsehair rein or just a marine rope type rein onto a slobber strap, there's a lot of weight hanging down on a slobber strap and on a knot, and that sort of gets quite active, and it ends up not much different than having a clip on the end of a big heavy clip on your lead rope hanging off the bottom of the holder swinging around. So when it comes to a rein, I like a rein that's got a reasonable weight. Like when I use light reins, the ones that are really light that you can't feel, the horse only really feels them when you pick up the contact, as in you start to pull a little on the rein. Whereas a little bit of a weighted rein, if it's a nice even weight right down to the bit, the horse can feel the amount of droop more. So I find I like it more when I'm using rein positions and stuff like that, because I can put a nice float in the rein and they just feel the take up of the rein a little more. And when you weight one rein higher and things like that, I just find I get a nicer feel on the horse, and I just feel it's I just like it like that. And I think the horses, it just gives you a little bit more understand. Like it's like turning a 3-speed into a 5 or 6-speed gearbox. You've got a few more positions that you can use, and the horse is more aware of the take up and the release. So yeah, if you go a leather rein, like I like a thicker leather rein, like some of those cutting reins are pretty nice that have got a bit of weight in them. And a marine rope rein's pretty good. But if you go too heavy, they're just a little bit too heavy and cumbersome. So I think about, is it 10 mil? What are our lead ropes about? 10 mil? Yeah, about I think it's about a 10 mil. It's not a bad thickness. If you put them on a slobber strap, just cut a little slobber strap, so and put a little knot in there, so there's more of an even take up instead of a heap of weight here. Because what I'm looking for is I want a fairly even weight from where it touches the bit all the way up to my hand. I don't want to sort of have this sort of weight here and then right at the end have a heavy bit that's outweighs that even weight that you've got all the way through to the bit.
So what about clip-on reins?
Well, clip-on reins are kind of good, but the only thing I don't like about clip, I don't like the clangy, steely feel on them. That's just my little pet hate on those. So, but you've got to be careful. So if you've got a tie-on rein, you can't put a tie. The reins that sort of tie and tighten onto the bit. you'd have to ride in a loose ring snaffle with those reins, because as they tighten on the bit, they cause a gag effect on any other bits, like a D bit or anything like that. They'll cause a gag effect. So if they'll always be tighten up on one spot, but if they tighten on the lower spots as you pick up, you'll twist the bit up like that. So you've got to be mindful that any reins that have that sort of knot that pulls tight on itself onto the bit are probably better suited to a loose ring snaffle, because the loose ring stops it from having a gag effect.
Right.
So yeah, you've got to have. I think the reins. It's good they can slip a little bit on the bit. So when you use a D bit or something like that, the rein will slip a little bit on it, not grab onto the ring. So if you're using leather reins, I'd say just one that's got a nice. There's different options that saddlers make that sort of have ways of tying leather reins on. Otherwise, just a fairly light, like a buckle. Though the clips are very easy, I just find them a bit clangy and they just clang on the bit a little bit, steel on steel. I'm just not a fan of too much steel on steel. But yeah, sorry, I don't want to lend you on it. Send you on a goose hunt, but yeah, just a nice even amount of weight, but not too heavy and not too much feedback from too much weight hanging off the bit itself.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. Hope that helps Karen. We'll talk to you again soon, Mark.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jenny.
You can learn more from Mark online through his online training videos. Just search Mark Langley Horsemanship. There's over 380 training videos which everyone has access to with a 7-day free trial. If you like what you see, it's just $15 a month from there. That's help where you need it.